Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is Shabbat, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 22. There are 24 verses in this chapter. I'm using a different microphone today, so hopefully the quality of the sound is not less than usual. Hopefully it's consistent with the previous videos. We're going to look at verse 1 first, and it says here that Elohim tempted Abraham. This is a big question as to, does God tempt? That's actually a really interesting question to ask. That brings to mind the scripture from James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15, where we read here, when someone is being put through an ordeal, they are not to say, I'm being put through an ordeal by Elohim, as Elohim cannot be put through an ordeal. And it has a footnote here for that. It says, apirastos, unable to be put through an ordeal, occurs only here in the New Testament, a rare word. And then it says here, continuing on, and God indeed, it says indeed, otos, nominative, emphatic. So emphatic, puts no one through an ordeal. Rather, each person goes through ordeals by being dragged along and hooked on a bait by their own wants and wishes. For footnote there, it says, does not mention the word evil. Then wants and wishes conceive and give birth to sin, and sin, when it grows up, produces death. So this sounds like an ordeal that leads one to sin. So that's one of the famous verses when it comes to temptation or being tempted. We understand that Elohim doesn't tempt us to sin. So why is it using this word, tempted, in both the Septuagint and the Masoretic? Well, one would have to reason that maybe it's a mistranslation. It could be tested. That makes more sense because God does test us to see our hearts, to see our character, whether we are obedient, how much we truly fear Him, love Him, respect Him, just how far we will go to obey Him and remain faithful to Him. So I think that word tempted is not translated correctly. We have to look at possibly, the Greek and the Hebrew to see, is there a more fitting word to replace that with? Because if you look at the account itself of what occurs in this chapter, he isn't being tempted to sin. He's being tested to see if he does fear Elohim or not. So we're going to continue on. That's only verse 1. We're still looking at the rest of verse 1. It says, look, it says, Abraham. So when Elohim calls our name, whatever your name is, the proper response is look, I, or behold, I. That's a Hebrewism. Behold, here I am. Look, I. That's like maybe a greeting, a response to someone calling you. That's the proper response, and that's what Samuel is also told to do. If I just look it up, give me a moment. Yeah. So in 1 Samuel chapter 3, I believe it's verse 2, talks about Samuel sleeping in the temple as a child, but in the Septuagint it's actually called 1 Kings, not 1 Samuel, and a lot of old Bibles will say this as well. And you'll see that Samuel was being called by Elohim, saying, Jehovah called Samuel, Samuel, and he said, behold, I. So that's something, it's a Hebrew custom, but then he went there the second time, and then Eli understood that it was Jehovah who had called the child, and he said, return, child, go to sleep, and it shall come to pass, If he shall call you, it's interesting that he knows the protocol. You shall say, speak, for your servant hears. And Samuel went and lay down in his place. Jehovah came and stood and called him as before. And there's a footnote here. It says, the war. Okay. Called him as the war. I'm not sure what that means, but it says there. Oh, as before, once and once. Okay. Called him as once and once. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. So that's the proper response. But we also see here, he said, look, I. So in this way, he didn't have to say that because at this time in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 3, it said there was no distinct vision, meaning could be dreams or prophetic vision. But when we're looking at Genesis 22, this isn't Abraham dreaming or asleep or having a vision. This is Elohim talking to him in real life, talking to him in waking life. He's awake, he's not sleeping, he's not dreaming. So this is a distinction to make. But that's one of the verses that come to mind when I think about this. Look, here am I. This account in Samuel / Kings. Verse 2, moving on. The beloved one says here, take your son, the beloved one. In the Masoretic, it says, take now your son, your only brackets son, Isaac. How can he be his only son if he technically has Ishmael, who was born before Isaac? How can he be his only son? Well, there's a term in Hebrew, and I remember from reading the Sefer, it didn't even say beloved or only son. It said, take your yachid in Hebrew. What does that mean? Well, I looked it up. Yachid means many things, can mean only one, but for this account, I feel it means more, it's closer to the definition here, the number 2 definition, my only one, poetic for my life. The one unique and priceless possession, which can never be replaced. That's an important point there. So it wasn't technically his only son, but he valued him as he valued his own life. That's the way a father sees his favorite child, greater than his own life. He's willing to lay down his life for his own child. That's how important they are. Looking now at the second half of the verse, it says, offer him for a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains. Okay, it says here, go into the highland versus the land of Moriah. So that could just be a translation, but I noticed that. Verse 3, servants. Abraham saddled his ass and he took with him 2 servants versus 2 young men. So they could be men, they could be women, they could be 1 man, 1 woman, but they're 2 servants. They're not just young men. They are specifically the servants of Abraham. Verse 4, on the 3rd day, in both accounts, possibly alluding to this journey being 3 days long to travel to this destination. Verse 5 reads, sit with the ass versus abide here. Abide means live. So are you just going to live here with the donkey? Or are you going to sit and wait? It's more specific in the Septuagint. Minor difference, but nonetheless, I must mention that yonder is used in verse 5. Verse 5, yonder. We will return to you. I and the lad, Isaac, will proceed thus far. We're going to go this far. Verses, we will go yonder and worship. So a little bit different in terms of the wording there, but Abraham is specifying we're going to proceed to a certain distance, but not where they are. So sit here, we're going to go and proceed to a certain length of distance, and having worship, we will return. So that's pretty similar, I'd say. Verse 7, this is an important point, and it changes the context a little bit. So Isaac said to his father, Father. And he said, What is it, my son? So he asked him a question. Versus, Father. And he said, Here am I, my son. That sounds kind of condescending, to be honest. It sounds very obvious to, Here am I. I'm right here. Sounds a little sarcastic too, depending how you say it. But when it's worded as, What is it, my son? Or what is it, son? That doesn't really leave it open to interpretation. It's a question. It is a it's not sarcasm. It isn't. It isn't obvious. It's just a conversation. What is it, son? And then you see the follow up. Behold the fire in the wood. Where's the sheep? It is a logical progression of this conversation. Whereas, Father, here am I, my son. Behold the fire in the wood. It's a little less coherent. It's not. It's like here am I, my son. It's not something that someone would naturally say. If someone would call me, hey, uh, Jack Knight, and I'll say, here am I. It sounds, do you hear the tone? Here am I. I'm here. Instead of saying, yeah, what is it? It sounds more like a conversation, basically. Okay, moving on. I don't want to harp on that point too much. Verse 9, the feet of Isaac. So he bound, it says, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood on it, and having bound the feet of Isaac, his son, together. So he only bound his feet, really, according to the Septuagint. Whereas in the MT it says he bound Isaac. It just doesn't say where, just bound him. Could have tied him up like a mummy. You really don't know. But here it is very specific. He bound only the feet of Isaac. He didn't have to bind anything else. Because Isaac wasn't being forced to be sacrificed. Isaac laid down his life uh, in agreement with his father, in agreement with Jehovah. It was something he wanted to do as an act of faith, as well as Abraham's act of faith of doing this. They were complicit to this instruction from Jehovah, both of them. A lot of people forget that and just think it's only Abraham. Isaac, too, showed faith. 12. It says, lay not your hand upon the child, neither do anything to him. And ironically, some texts say that he was in his 30s by this time, Isaac, time of his sacrifice, being sacrificed. And it says here, for I know that you fear Elohim. I know you fear Elohim. It says that in both. So what is the principle here? Well, to fear Elohim isn't just, I'm afraid of Elohim, because if Abraham was only afraid of Elohim, he would just, show terror and be horrified at Elohim. But that's not the way we understand fear in a biblical context. The fear of Elohim, Yirat of Elohim is, or Adonai or Jehovah, means to love Jehovah, means to obey Jehovah, means to love to obey Jehovah. And you can see in this account that it is definitely linked to obedience, fear. And then it says in the second half of the verse, your beloved son, you're only from me. It doesn't, although it says son there, son is in brackets, so you're one and only, your special possession, like it says here. Your one unique and priceless possession, which can never be replaced. a poetic term of endearment. Verse 13, this is an interesting one. It says that there was a ram who was caught by his horns in a plant of savak versus thicket of a thicket, like a thicket of thorns, possibly. What is a plant of savak? I looked it up. We have many different possibilities here. There is a plant called the dill weed or the dill plant, and it is known as sabaka in India, I believe. Uh, we also see a city in Serbia called Savak, related to a river called the Sava, which is near the Mediterranean area, near Italy and the Middle East. So it very much in Europe, I should say, Europe and the Middle East. So it could be from this area of Savak, but it's hard to say conclusively what that means. But that's only speculation, because if you were to do a study on this name, it's hard to find anything except for a Egyptian crocodile-headed Elohim. Okay, so I want to mention Yehovah Yireh as well, but I'll mention that before we close. So I'm just going to close these windows, these tabs, and so I can see that we just have that one tab to speak about. So moving on, we see here in verse 14, oh, there it goes, Jehovah has seen. So Abram called the name of that place, Jehovah has seen. The MT says, Yehovah Yireh. That is often understood or translated as not as seen, although it says here a transliteration means to see or to foresee, but it is often used to say Jehovah provides. Let me just pause it while I get a bit more understanding about this meaning. They understand it to mean that Jehovah foresees. So with foreseeing is provision. So that's why they connect that to Jehovah provides. He not only sees, but he sees beforehand and looks at what we need, which is providing beforehand. So they connect that, and that's why it's understood that way. That's fine. That's people's understanding. I'm not going to argue about that, but it just says what it says. So Jehovah has seen, past tense. Verse 16, it says here, Jehovah says, because you have done this thing, and on my account have not spared your beloved son, your yachid. Versus, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son. Do you see the difference? He didn't just do this thing. He did this on his account, on out of respect for Jehovah, because he realized his own life, his son's life, are all given by Jehovah. So he will provide. And he trusts him wholeheartedly that he would not lead him in the wrong way and to do a wrong thing. He'll only lead him in a way that will be good to perfect him. You can see in verse 17, it says here, the cities. Your seed shall inherit the cities of their enemies versus the gate of his enemies. Verse 18, listened. Because you have listened to my voice versus you have obeyed my voice. It's important to understand that the Hebraic understanding of the word listen or shema is not only to physically listen with your ears, it's also to obey. They go hand in hand. If you're going to listen, you listen and you obey. You hear and obey. That's just common sense in Hebrew, if you understand Hebrew. Versus, for example, believe. If someone believes something, they don't just understand it and know it. They actually do it. They live it. So when it says Abraham believed, well, He knew it and he did it. If you know something, you don't do it, you don't really believe. So that's the difference when it comes to Greek and Hebrew. Hebraic understanding of faith, you know and you do. You believe it and you do it. Greek is you just believe it. You don't really have to do it. And that's the problem with the English language or English culture, is that we've led people to uh, use that word in the context that we don't actually have to do anything. We just have to believe something in our hearts and our minds. Same with listen. We've corrupted the language to mean only listen, but not do anything about it. So that is a important fact, important thing to express, to explain. Verse 19, we have the well of the oath, or in the MT it's called Beersheba. So it very well is just most likely a translation of what Beersheba means, the well of the oath. And yeah, so with that, that's the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text for Genesis chapter 22. Yehovah bless you. Shabbat Shalom. May He make your way prosperous. May He give you a heart to love Him with all your mind, all your strength, all your soul, and to love each other as Yehoshua loved us. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I love you. Jehovah loves you. And until next time, we'll look at Genesis chapter 23.